Welcome to Books in the Freezer, a podcast dedicated to the deliciously disturbing world of horror fiction. And the time is here, the end of the year, which means it's time for Best of. And you know who has to come back for Best of? It's OG co host Rachel.
Thanks for having me back once again. It's always a delight to be back on the podcast to get a chance to catch up with you and get to
Yeah.
gush about books. I feel like I'm lucky that I always think it's the best episode of the year, in my opinion, not because I'm on it, but just because who doesn't love a whole podcast full of all the best recommendations for the year? And I feel like it's been a really good year, so I can't wait to get into it.
It has. I feel like we go through this every year. We're like, every year you worry halfway through the year because you haven't found a five-star read. You're like, I'm not going to have anything to talk about at the end of the year because I didn't love anything. And that wasn't the case this year then?
Yeah, I feel like I didn't even send you the usual panic halfway through message saying, find someone else, I'm useless. I remember this year just took a turn, especially the second half, I gotta say, was just really strong, at least for me. Maybe you have a different experience, but for those who do consistently listen to the podcast, the last couple of years, I kind of hinted at I didn't want to be too loud about it, but I had a tough year when it comes to horror. Love the genre, but it's always a question of, was I falling out of love with it? Was I just not loving what was getting published? Was it just not for me? And I certainly found picks. To be fair, everything that I recommended on the podcast, I completely stand by. But there wasn't a lot that I didn't talk about that I loved. And that was not the case this year. This year, I had to, be reasonable about the amount of time we are going to spend here. You're talking about some of my favorites, which helped to get me through my list. But consistently, one of my personal favorite years of horror, just one that's really kind of brought me back to the roots of like, oh, this is why I'm completely obsessed with this genre. I don't know. So, what was your year like? Maybe you had a completely different experience and we're on a totally different page.
There was a lot of books I really liked, a lot that surprised me, some that you're talking about, which always gets me excited. I know we talk about that when it's like, yay, they liked it too, or we both had so many picks. I don't feel like we felt like we had to fight over like, oh,
Yeah.
she took mine or oh no.
Yeah. Exactly. Because in the past, it's like, well, that was the one book I had for this category. So I want that. But this year, so many good ones.
Did you notice any trends or themes in stuff that was getting published this year?
So, a few things that stood out to me, and I'll talk about it as we go through. So, one being a lot of books that dealt with mental health in different ways. Not to say that that hasn't been a theme in the past with horror. It's probably one of my favorite is kind of that piece of psychological horror that bends into it. And often there can be books that talk about or play with the theme rather of whether or not someone is crazy or are they actually seeing something. But I felt like this year, for me at least, a lot of the books that dealt with mental health dealt with it in a really nuanced way and didn't just use it as a trope to advance the plot. There also were a
Hmm.
surprising amount of books I personally read. I don't know if I just was reading in a strange corner of the market, but a lot of ones that were dissecting the health and beauty and diet and fitness industries. I had
Yeah.
several books that I read all on those topics, and really enjoyed them. Different conversations. I think just a lot of topics going on in the larger social commentary around these that, of course, blend into
Hmm.
the books. And I know you're talking specifically about horror, but for me, one of the interesting runoffs was I also, of course, read a lot of thrillers, which, of
Yeah.
course, the two genres can blend so much together. And this was a year that really had me fall back in love with thrillers. Years ago, I used to read thrillers a lot more
Hmm.
consistently, and I kind of moved from thrillers over to horror primarily. But this year, I don't know again if I just was in the right mood for it, but I found thriller after thriller that I loved, which was really nice.
Oh.
That we'll be talking primarily horror on this podcast, but again, I ended up doing a whole top 10 list on my channel about thrillers because there were so many I loved, so many that just had me smiling or twists and turns that just again kind of reminded me why I used to like the genre so much and got me right back there again. How about you?
Yeah. I remember I used to be a big thriller girl.
I was. If anything, I feel like that was my roots that I was known for seeking out and loving the really dark and disturbing thrillers. And then I kind of was like, why don't I read more horror? And then it was a deep dive off the ledge from there.
Yeah. I felt that there were a lot of really good slashers that came out this year, and everyone knows I'm a big slasher fan. And I know as a written genre, I think it's pretty hit or miss with people because it has such a tight definition of like the formula it needs to follow.
Yeah.
But there was truly so much stuff that came out this year, and I mean, two of the big ones were by Stephen Graham Jones,
Yeah.
that really, I felt like, pushed what you can do within that formula and still have it read like a love letter to slasher fans.
And tying in with the slashers, I think just in general, I actually saw a lot of, I want to call it metafiction. So, again, that horror that really is written for people who love, especially horror movies, kind of playing with the layers of
Mhm.
that, which is
Yeah,
something that I've seen before but never get tired of. And certainly I saw quite a few times this year in my own reading.
yeah. Have you looked at the books coming out next year? Do you have like any predictions of what themes we'll see in 2025, or have you already taken a look and kind of seen some trends?
That's a good question. I know I did a glance towards this coming year, but not too much of a deep dive. I kind of tend to come as the books, become available through the library or through publishers. So I'm expecting, I won't say more of the same, but not in a bad way. That I think, again, like if I had to guess, like this, a lot of the themes we saw coming through again, kind of a lot of the nuance around like mental health, dissection of kind of whatever is popular or happening in our world always seems to reflect into horror. I know in
Yeah,
Grady Hendrix's nonfiction book, he talked a lot about that, of really looking through the different eras. And that's something
yeah,
that horror does well. I know there's a lot of conversation right now about horror should stay apolitical and shouldn't dive into issues, but it's actually interesting. And again, this is whatever, side of the different issues you land on, that horror tends to be a reflection of what we're seeing in the day. So I'm expecting to see what we're seeing right now, kind of, how will that manifest? Like, will there be
yeah.
horror about TikTok influencers or different angles of kind of what's big and buzzy this year? How will that move into next year? So I don't have the most specific predictions. How about yourself?
I recorded an episode with Neil on Talking Scared where he asked this, and Emily Hughes had a really interesting prediction, and I would kind of like to see this, but she was saying a bit more kind of maximalist, just like turned up to 11, just like we are going balls to the wall, crazy horror, like Rest Stop, or like is it Fever House, that like Keith Rawson
Mhm.
duology, just like horror that is just kind of throwing everything at the wall.
I think that would be fun to see, especially as horror's become more popular in the last few years. I think there's been a bit of a pressure to make it more mainstream and not to sound like a hipster, but with that always comes the pressure to make everything very safe for all audiences and kind of meeting
Yeah,
in the middle. And so perhaps there's a little bit of pressure, not to go straight perhaps to extreme horror per se, if that's not what you're saying, but to kind of push the limits again and
yeah,
kind of see what the appetite is. I think in mainstream publishing would be really fun to explore.
yeah, not to dilute it, to make it more
Exactly.
palatable. Um, Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think in kind of uncertain times, it's interesting to see what people want to see. I think it was, when I was talking to Cynthia Pelayo earlier this year, she was saying, like, I've noticed people have either really gotten into, like, I want darker, more intense stuff, or I want um like a quieter horror. So
Yeah,
people are different in what
exactly.
they want during.
Yeah, exactly. People either want to kind of see the worst case scenario of things that they fear, or again, very much going the other way with more cozy fiction, like we see in other genres, like romantasy and cozy fantasy are huge these days. So that's actually, yeah, no, I want to change my prediction to saying let's see more cozy horror. So either more extreme horror, more cozy horror, or maybe a bit of both.
Yeah.
I'm going to cover all my bases in my predictions here.
All right. Well, should we get into talking about books? Because we have
Let's do it.
quite a few to talk
Yeah.
about. All right. Let's start off with a favorite short story collection. What did you have this year?
Sounds good. So with short stories, I often say that in the last couple of years, I haven't read as many, but I do have one that I think is great to read at the end of the year, and that is Christmas and Other Horrors, a Winter Solstice anthology by the renowned Ellen Datlow, or specifically edited by her. While I don't read a lot of short stories, I will read anything that she collects. There is something about her talent to curate a good anthology. For those of you that are perhaps like me and read more full length fiction, more novels, you'll find a lot of really familiar authors So we have Tiana Ruth Dew, we have Stephen Graham Jones. My favorite actually was Tiana Ruth Dew's story in here because of the fact that it really dives into generational trauma. You have these characters going back to the family home, the family cabin, and of course, all of the dissection that comes with unpacking all that baggage. I do want to clarify that while this collection references Christmas, it is more so focusing on the general winter time period. So if you're someone who, again, wants to read this in January or doesn't celebrate Christmas specifically, these stories are all just kind of that wintry, cold feeling to them. If you're looking for just nonstop elves and Santa and all of that, this one is less in your face, which I really enjoyed. I think it's a more subtle approach to the winter season and not going so much for the obvious choices. So I really enjoyed that one quite a bit. How about you?
I loved Mariana Enriquez's short story collection that came out this year, A Sunny Place for Shady People. This was translated by Megan McDowell. I loved Things We Lost in the Fire. I think that's one of my like all-time favorite short story collections. And I was not let down by this. I love the way her stories, they're all set in Argentina. They're talking about the political climate. They're talking about, what it's like to live there. She is such a master at using horror to tell these stories. Like there's a story about this apartment complex, and everyone in this apartment complex is essentially being haunted by the ghost of a boy who like died a violent death, and like no one intervened, and so he essentially just like bothers people and is a nuisance and is like knocking on doors. There's a story about the Cecil Hotel. It's about like a woman going to like investigate a cult that's formed around the mysterious death of Elisa Lamb. I was like, there's very interesting, even the variety of the stories and what she's tackling. They don't feel like I am telling an important story and I am tackling a heavy subject. They still deliver as horror stories, but there's so much depth to them.
I love that collection.
Yeah.
I didn't read a lot of short stories this year, but this is one of the other ones I read. And like you, I loved their original short story that was, or collection rather, that was translated. And this one was phenomenal. And again, this is someone who kind of has shifted away from short stories, but she always brings me back to the format.
Hmm.
I just think she's brilliant and haunting. And like you mentioned, she kind of tackles some of those darker, deeper issues, but does so in a way that you can read it on multiple layers if you're looking for just a really good, dark, twisty group of stories. It has that. And if you're looking for more, it's all there underneath, which I love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really need to read her. Did you ever read her novel, Our Share of Night?
Yes, that one's a great generational story. I'm all about generational stories apparently today, but that's worth reading. It's a long one for sure. It's a bit of an investment, but worth it. I
That's
think you'll really like it.
that's what intimidated me. But I just every time I read one of her short story collections, it's one of those things where I'm reminded that she's such a great writer. So
Yeah.
reading a larger book is not going to be a chore.
Yeah. I did fly through it.
Good to know. All right, moving on to our favorite novella.
For sure. I can go first. So, my novella is not just my favorite novella, but one of my favorite stories of the entire year. So, highly recommend this one. If you're only going to take a few recommendations from me, I hope this is one of them. And that is Coup de Grace by Sophia Adram. And this is a story of a young man who is in Montreal, Canada. He is thinking about ending his life. So, of course, trigger warnings for anyone who's sensitive to that subject matter. And the story starts out with him looking to jump into the St. Lawrence River to end it. However, when he jumps in, he instead finds himself within the subway system of Montreal. And from there, it begins this really twisted psychological, out of the box horror experience. The marketing around this book all compares it to House of Leaves, which I think is a very dangerous comparison to make about just about any book because that one is so unique and so special that I am hesitant to make that comparison. But yet, this is the first book that I've seen compared to that that actually scratches somewhat of the same itch because very much it deals with this physical space that is really, in a lot of ways, seen as a manifestation of what is happening in this individual's mind. So you see them wandering around the tunnels, exploring it in that way. And then as the story progresses, it really does move into one of the darkest, most memorable horror stories, some really disturbing moments, things and scenes that just stick in my head. And so I found this book to be very haunting, very mysterious or suspenseful as you're wandering through it. And I end up loving it. I'm always cautious to oversell an ending, but it is one of the most special or unique endings that I've read in a horror book. It's just something that I've seen an ending like this before, but never applied to the context that it's put in here. And it's the kind of ending where I smiled, I laughed, I wanted to throw the book, and I loved it all at the same time. It's going to be an ending that people will remember. I'm not saying everyone is going to love the ending as much as I did, but I love an author that experiments, that takes a chance. And doing what this author does, I just thought it was brilliant. And it's, again, such a short little book, but easily one of my most memorable books of the year. Highly recommend this one. It doesn't hurt the fact that I adore Montreal as a city. I think it's beautiful. I want to travel there again. And it really paints a beautiful picture of the city and getting inside this mind of this individual. And I just thought it was so well done. Highly recommend. That again is Coup de Grace.
I love that. I mean, this book has been on my TBR forever, but when I saw it was your favorite novella of the year, it flew to the top. So I will be buying it. I will be reading it.
I feel
Eh,
very confident you're going to love it. It's exactly a you book.
Perfect. Like everything I've heard about it, I'm like, "Yeah, I would love this."
You will absolutely love it. I was
Okay.
wanting to tell you to read it sooner, but I also didn't want you to steal my pick. So I was like, oh,
Okay.
we'll talk about it year end. Then you can read it next year.
You don't have to worry because there was a ton of novellas that came out this year
Yeah.
that I've been enjoying, and it feels like the indies are doing it. Shortwave has really been putting out a lot of really great novellas, and I feel like I really need to go back and read everything they've put out. But what I've read
Hmm.
from them, I've really enjoyed. But not from Shortwave. I wanted to talk about Woodworm by Leila Martinez. This was translated from Spanish by Sophie Hughes. And this follows two characters. They are both unnamed. It's a granddaughter and a grandmother. And they live in this odd house in this village. And the the plot of the book is kind of like the weird history of this house. It has surreal elements, like they're talking about like ghosts and specters and angels. The kind of big thing that's going on is that there is a wealthy family in the village and something has happened to their son. Their son has gone missing and the people in the village blame the granddaughter. The way this book is written and the amount of both female rage and just class rage you feel within the pages. I had basically forgotten that I was supposed to care about like this little boy who went missing. Like I was like, I just really want to hear I just really want to hear what you have to say. You ever get like into books like that where you're like, oh yeah, there's a plot going on, but
Oh, 100%.
I'm just really loving the writing. It is class rage though. This is a quote from the book. Those suck ups in the village stopped talking to us, as if whoever received the most pats on the head from the master would magically stop being a dog.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, and it's a novella. It's short, and I feel very validated that I have seen it on a few best of lists because this was when I had decided, like, right when I read it earlier this year, I was like, this is a best. This is a best of. Um, and so I don't know. Do you ever feel vindication when you like pick a book and you see it on other best ofs? You're like, yes, I knew it.
Yes. I have the unfortunate feeling, I feel like I often see it on people's worst stuff. I just posted, it's technically my science fiction list, and I posted the exact same as someone else who also reviews a lot of science fiction. And two of my top favorites were two of her worst of the year books. So I got a lot of comments saying, so which is it? Is it the worst or the best? And I was like, well, you decide. I feel like I have a lot of unpopular opinions. But to answer you, yes, I love that idea when I exactly something I'm like, this is a favorite for me. This is an amazing book,
Yeah,
but then it's always the question of what does everyone else think? Am I an outlier on
yeah.
my own little island over here, or is there uh,
Hmm.
someone backing me up?
Yeah. It's so funny because I watch your worst of. We'll talk about this later, but I
Yes.
watch it every year, absolutely knowing that at least two of my favorite books of the year are going to be on your list. And you know what? It's fine. We are friends. It doesn't affect this at
Thankfully,
all.
I, I haven't lost you yet with my very unpopular opinion. We'll discuss it for sure. I laughed when you
Yeah.
DM'd me because I kind of knew. I was like, oh, I'm stepping on toes with this one for sure.
Um,
Just crushed your spirits a little bit this year.
it's
That's all.
okay. I'm a big girl. I can handle people not liking books I like. That's totally fine.
Love it.
I did want to squeeze in mentioning two more novellas I really liked, though. Um, I loved Ein Hollow by Tim McGregor, which was a historical fiction kind of Frankenstein retelling. It's a novella, so I don't want to say too much, but just go read it. It's really good. I
Hmm.
also loved Rest Stop by Nat Cassidy, which I just finished like yesterday. So I literally had to put it on the dock this morning. I truly, like, literally just finished reading it. And it was very, like Emily Hughes was saying, like balls to the wall, up to 11. Like a man is stuck in a gas station restroom, and the things that go on, the things that happen. I think you
Hmm.
would like it.
Wow,
Um,
definitely sounds up my alley.
yeah. Also, like Candy Cane, the Candy Cane Kills sequel too. Like, there's just too many. There's too many. But we can move on to our favorite young adult book.
For sure. I'll go first again. My pick is another one of my strongest recommendations of the year. I love this book. And keep in mind, I don't read a lot of young adult. I definitely prefer adult fiction. But I do think that this is one that very much, while it will speak to teens on a certain wavelength, it also has a lot of cross appeal for adults like myself that are many years away from our teen years now. So that book is Compound Fracture by Andrew Joseph White. This is the same author who wrote Hell Followed With Us, which I believe I would have recommended the year that it came out because I love that one too. Clearly, he
Hmm.
is one of my favorite YA authors at this point. This book follows a young trans boy who's also autistic, and he is living in a small town where you find out that there is a lot of generational trauma and rage, and just the ghosts of the past are coming back. Within the start of the story, and this is not a spoiler, it's all in the setup, there is an attempted murder on his life, and then the story spirals from there as he deals with rebellion and teen rage and just trying to survive. So, a couple things I need to mention with this book. First off, it does have some early harm to animals, which I know is a no go for some people. So, just to keep that in mind. And also, whenever I talk about my favorite horror books of the year, I typically get this comment of people saying, well, these books sound interesting, they sound nice, they sound good, but which ones are the really scary ones? What's the most disturbing book you read this year? What's something really gruesome and messed up? If people are listening to this podcast and wondering that, for myself at least, this was surprisingly the most disturbing book, most messed up book I read this year. So don't be confused by the YA label and assume that it's going to be all sweet and appropriate for young people. It's certainly meant for an older young adult audience and does deal with a lot of mature themes, but if you can handle it, it was certainly a book that goes there. It had some really traumatic scenes, some really memorable scenes. Again, the image of the nail, and I should probably stop there because I don't even want to describe the scene, but you will see it at the beginning. It's imagery that follows throughout the book. It's referenced on the cover of the book if you look it up. And it's just one of the most visceral reading experiences I had this year. So, again, if you're looking for something that really goes there, this is definitely my recommendation.
I love that. I have not read that. He's an author I need to read, though.
Another one I think you'd love. Hell Forward for It. Another one I think you'd really love. His other book is great as well.
My favorite young adult book of the year was the third installment in the Clown in a Cornfield series, The Cult of Friendo by Adam Caesar. I really loved the first Clown in a Cornfield when it came out. And then I don't know why I didn't read the second one right when it came out, but these things happen. Like we read so much, sometimes books just like pass us by.
Hmm.
Um, but so this year I read the second one leading up to the release of this one. So I kind of read them back to back. And I have just loved this series. I loved where it goes. I love the evolution of Quinn as a final girl in the third installment. We've kind of seen a lead up to her becoming more of a morally gray character in this like quest for vengeance, which I thought was just a very interesting turn for her. But then also you see the way that this cult like takes over a town, and I don't know, the horror also goes there. Like if you've listened to Adam Caesar talk, like he is a like horror fan with like capital H. Like he loves horror movies, and you can see the familiarity and the knowledge come through in his writing in a way that isn't like this is only for horror fans. Like it's very approachable, but horror fans will see.
Yes, he is just one of my favorite YA horror authors these days. I think he's just so brilliant at just again like writing books where the teenagers really feel like teenagers. I believe
Yeah.
he is or was a high school teacher himself, so very much being able to capture their essence, but writing very much books that appeal to anyone of any age that loves horror because his love for horror comes across to the page and he's just has such a good enthusiasm for it that I love.
All right, let's move on to our favorite nonfiction of the year. What do you have?
For sure. I have a travel book for you, and that is
Ooh,
Travels of Terror Strange and Spooky Spots Across America by Kelly Florence and Meg Haftel. And these are the two co hosts of the Horror Rewind podcast, for anyone who is familiar with that one. And I picked up this book. It was offered to me for review, and I was very eager to read it. I'm doing more travel for work in the US because I've mentioned I'm here in Canada typically. And so it goes through the various parts of the US, talking about not just the obvious spooky places, but really diving into particular themed hotels, restaurant experiences, places that are known to be haunted, attractions for horror fans. And I really loved how comprehensive it was. I've read books like this before that are very surface level, and instead, this one felt incredibly well researched. Again, I like that it referenced multiple places, multiple states. Really, if you're going east, west, north, south, or anywhere in the middle, quite frankly, you will have places to go and see. And I have not planned this trip yet, but I would very much love to use this book as a starting point if I were to plan a spooky adventure through the States and go about and check out a lot of these. I might not be able to tell my husband ahead of time. He might not agree to this trip, so I might just quietly build it into our itinerary, is what I'm thinking, and then just be like, "Oh, look, honey, this spooky thing is over here, and oh, I booked the hotel. It's vampire themed. What do you think?" And just spring it on him is my best, I think, plan to make this trip happen.
I love that. I did that when we went to New Orleans.
Did
And one day
you?
I was like, we should go see the American Horror Story Coven House. Because
There
it's
you go.
right here, we might as well. It's only like 2 blocks away. We
How
must.
did that happen?
That's so
Oh, I
crazy.
love
How did
it.
we end up here?
So good.
Um, I have two nonfiction books. One of them is Horror for Weenies. I think it's Everything You Need to Know About the Movies You're Too Scared to Watch by Emily Hughes. And I had so much fun reading this as someone who like watches a lot of horror movies. Um, but this book is, I would say, marketed for people that kind of want to know what movies are about, but they're a little too scared, they're intimidated. And so it is essentially like a plot breakdown of like, here's what happens, here's what you need to know, here's some big cultural markers to like start, here's some conversation starters, here's some trivia. But I think that the magic of this book is truly Emily's humor, her wit, just in these plot breakdowns. The way she tells the story and tells you what is happening just had me cackling, had me like laughing out loud. Um, like if you've seen The Wicker Man, the old one,
Hmm.
she's like, this is we're following a policeman who has never read any room he has ever walked into. And I'm like, yes, he truly like never reads the room.
I love that.
Ever.
So good.
um, so I had a ton of fun with that. So even if you are someone who watches horror movies, you will get enjoyment out of this. And I think this is also such a perfect gift book for
Yeah,
someone
I was
who's
just
like
thinking.
horror averse
Yeah.
in your life, or
Yes.
like if you're the kind of person that loves the idea of horror movies but you like kind of looking up Wikipedia plot summaries instead, or you do that
Yep.
before watching it, this is a great book for you.
Yeah. I can think of a lot of friends this would make a great gift for that hopefully won't be listening to this podcast.
Well, then they won't know you're getting it for them.
There you
Um,
go.
my second pick is this one called Gorgeous by Alexandra West. This
Nice.
is personal essays on beauty and horror. And Alexandra West is one half of the Faculty of Horror podcast, which I love and have been listening
Yes.
to for years. So
Same.
I was very excited about this. And what I like about this is that, I mean, it truly is like personal essay. So she is talking about her life and her musings on beauty standards, patriarchy, and the way they are depicted in these movies. And I mean, if you've listened to the podcast, you know, she's like a very intelligent person. So,
Mhm.
of course, that's
Yeah.
coming through in here. But, you know, there's also a lot of vulnerability and raw emotion as she's talking about personal things in her life. But I really loved it. She talks about movies like the first essay is called Born with It, Natural Beauty and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 1937, and The Witches, 1990.
Mhm.
Um, or A Night to Dismember, Ritualized Beauty in Carrie, 1976, and The Loved Ones, 2009. It's like very
Oh,
interesting essays. I highlighted a bunch out of this. So
that sounds
that is,
fantastic.
yeah, it was really good. That is Gorgeous, personal. It's not the word gorgeous. It is gore, like horror gore dash just. So gore just personal essays on beauty and horror by Alexandra West.
There we go. More horror themed all around the beauty industry. I love it.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about graphic novels.
Sure. I'm going to go first because I'm predictable. Once again, I have a Junji Ito pick because apparently all I do is read his manga. And the one I want to highlight this year is one of his new release, or at least newly translated to English, and that is Mimi's Tale of Terror. These are ones where he adapted short stories that were written by other individuals into his manga style. And so this is one of my favorites where he's done this because he has done it in other books because of the fact that I felt the stories themselves were quite strong. And then you bring in his fantastic black and white illustrations. If you know him, you know, again, if there's anyone listening to this who hasn't checked out his work, I think he has such an iconic style and just as great for creating these imaginative ways of drawing that involves often body horror, psychological horror. You have a blend of all these different genres. So two of my favorite stories within this collection include Just the Two of Us and also Scarlet Circle. I want to describe them, but I feel like even describing them would give away too much. So just know that this, of all of his translated books this year, is definitely my favorite in terms of a graphic work. So highly recommend.
Listen, I love that you bring a Junji Ito every year. It's a brand. My favorite graphic novel was Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees, which I hadn't heard of until like Clay McLeod Chapman came on for an episode. I think we were doing summer scares, and he mentioned it as kind of something he was enjoying. So I looked through Hoopla and saw that it was available to read, and I was very excited. It's very the style. The art style is very cartoony. It's very reminiscent of, I mean, it's a graphic novel, but it's very reminiscent of
Yep.
like Richard Scarry. Like it's this
Hmm.
town with these animals, and you know, like there's a bear that runs a hardware store. You know, like it looks
Oh.
very wholesome, and that's the
Hmm.
tone for the first few pages. It's like, isn't this a wholesome small town? Until you see a bear who takes a trip to the city and murders a random person, and it's just when you get to the page after so yeah, it's shocking that this bear from this nice small town has murdered this other person from the city. But you get to the page where they have like their body like dissected into like
Hmm.
separate parts is jarring. So you're like, what? And that is the tone of the book. You're like, it's like, look at these cute little animals. Like, oh my God.
I am so excited for this one. I must have missed that recommendation when your guest was on because this looks adorable. I love the
Yeah.
illustrations. I'm looking it up right now as you're talking. And This I'm going to have to see if my library has as soon as we get off of this call
Yeah,
because I really want to read this and I'll buy it if they don't have it because this
yeah,
sounds deceptively adorable, which is kind of my favorite kind of horror some days.
yeah. It is. It's
Yeah.
deceptively adorable, and the plot is essentially that the the person that she killed was actually a member of the small town, and now the people in the small town are freaking out, and she was kind of like, oh no, I kept my serial killing separate from my small town life, and now they're becoming one. Oh no, serial killer problems.
Love it. Oh, this makes me excited.
So it's kind of like Dexter in that way. It's Dexter meets Richard Scary,
I would never thought I'd hear those two compared together.
as one does.
Oh yeah.
All right, well, should we talk about some of the non-horror things we liked?
Sure. I'm going to start by cheating because I have so much horror I like that I'm going to include it as my science fiction pick. So, this is a crossover. It's a sci fi horror, really a dystopian novel that I think will appeal to both sides of the genre. And I had too many favorite novels in the horror category already. And that is Womb City. I'll let people look up the author's name just because I don't want to mispronounce it on this podcast here. But this is one of my all time favorite books of the year. So, this is a dystopian
Wow.
set in a future where we follow an individual, this woman, who, first off, it is set in a future where individuals, if they have enough money, are able to pay to become young again by moving their consciousness into a younger body. And so often the bodies that they're getting moved into are those that have done crimes and are on death row or in prison. And so those that have, again, the privilege to move on in life do, but they live with the consequences of the bodies that they inherit. And this young woman in her new body is struggling with fertility. She is trying to have a child, however, her body is not having it. And so you follow her at the beginning as she is going through various practices. They're looking at infertility, IVF treatments, and then looking at having a womb, essentially an artificial womb that will carry the child as a surrogate. So she's dealing with a lot of the guilt and trouble, the fact that she herself, her body is failing her, and it's seen as very much a reflection on her own self worth. And so, the beginning of the book, with all of the fertility levels to it, I've mentioned it before in the podcast. I won't do a deep dive to save everyone the rehash, but it hit very much home to me. There, even I think our present day, is a lot of feelings that women have about their ability to bear children if they want to and aren't able to, especially without unnatural intervention. And so a lot of conversations there that just hit me in the emotional feels. And then this book has so many layers on top of it. As I mentioned, it's dystopian that felt very reminiscent of something like Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, where you deal with a woman who doesn't have a lot of autonomy over her body. Her husband very much is in control of her life, and of course the larger society issues coming about a society that is obsessed with becoming younger. And of course when they do become younger, they then want to take advantage of the new life that they have, are often leaving behind their elder spouse who is still typically in their old body as well, and so they move on to newer, younger things. And so there are just multiple layers to the story. It
Mhm.
deals with a lot of deeper themes and then does transpire into this fast paced action sci fi thriller towards the end. So for me, this book has it all. It's very ambitious, trying to do a lot of things. For me, it worked very well. And I loved all of the pieces that were jigsawed together. Really strong character, really strong themes. Not the easiest book to read, as you can probably imagine. It's hard hitting, it's unflinching, it doesn't promise to have a nice, sweet, happy ending with a bow tied around it. But again, I think a lot of people who love horror, if you love horror that leans into dystopian, if you love that kind of science fiction, this one really blends together all of them to something that I thought was really fresh and really new, even if the general themes are things that you might have seen before in a different package.
I'd heard about this one from your channel, but it sounds so fascinating. Mm.
Yeah. I feel like I'm the only one yelling about it online, so I'll keep going. I do recognize it's not for everyone, but very much it was completely up my alley. It felt like one of those times where you
Mhm.
read a book that's written right for you and reading
Yeah.
it at just the right time. I think, again, you want to be in the right mental space. Had I picked it up in a different mood, I might have felt differently about it, but ended up just adoring it. My other non-horror pick is a thriller because, like I mentioned, this was a fantastic year, so I wanted to highlight one of those. And that was What Have You Done by Sherry Lapina. I've read this author before and really enjoyed her storytelling. I think she's just really good at writing engaging narratives where they're fast paced, they're fun, and have some good twists within them. This one is set up around multiple points of view. There is a young girl who is found dead, and then we follow the story from her boyfriend's perspective as well as the boyfriend's parents. And the general setup of this one is the fact that we know from reading from even the boyfriend's perspective that he is not telling the truth to the cops. And then we also, of course, follow from his parents' perspective, who also know that he's probably not telling the truth. And it's a question about whether or not they seek justice for this young woman or do they protect their son. And of course, I'm purposely holding back a lot of the information that happens within this book. A lot of it you get to figure out for yourself as to what they're not telling, what actually happened, and it is more complex than first meets the eye. But I love the various layers to it. I'm a huge fan of that close person perspective when you know the person is not telling the truth, that they're holding things back, but we don't know what. It kind of reminds me of the setup of something like Gone Girl, where you have Nick, very similar there, but it certainly goes in
Yeah.
different direction. And I also really related to the mother's perspective of what do you do when your precious son is being held under suspicion for something and you know he's holding something back. You know he's not this perfect little angel. And it's just a question of how bad is it going to be? How far does it go? And do you protect him? Or what is your moral code in the situation? I just
Yeah.
love the grappling with morality and all the characters trying to figure it out. It felt very juicy, and I just had such a good time with it, if I'm honest.
It sounds very juicy. And I agree. I do love that close person perspective. One of my favorite books of the year was, it came out in 2021, I believe, or at least the translation did, but it was My Husband by Maud Ventura. And this was translated by Emma Ramadan from French. There's nothing I love more than like an unhinged first person narrator. Like where,
Hmm.
it's first person and immediately you're like, you are unwell. This whole book, and it's darkly hilarious. It's this woman who is literally just obsessed with her husband. You are in her point of view, and I kid you not, every single thought she has is about her husband and everything her
Mm.
husband does and obsessing about how to be more appealing to him and would he like it more if I did this, but what if I did this, and everything she does is like some secret code, and it's like, well, if I pick this movie he's going to notice that it's this, which will remind him of our first date when I said this thing. um, and this couple has been married for a while. They have like two children. She does not think about her children at all. She only thinks about them like in relation to her husband.
Nice.
They're at a dinner party in one scene, and I forget how it even comes up, but she asks him like what food she reminds him of, and he says a clementine. And when I tell you that fucks with her for like the entirety of the novel, she's like, a clementine? Why would he a clementine? He doesn't know me at all.
I'm kind of with her on that one. I love it.
So yeah, it is just this book about obsession through this woman's point of view. I loved the ending. I don't want to say too much. It's just, it was funny. I had a good time with it. It did what it was supposed to do, you know. Um, and then my other favorite book, I feel like kind of had a similar energy, at least in the beginning. And that is Annie Bot. I want to say it's by Sierra Greer. Yes, we will talk about. But essentially, this is about, you are following Annie Bot, who is a kind of AI robot companion. She was originally a like house cleaning model, but then her owner Doug kind of upgraded her to a relationship model that he could, have a relationship with, physically and emotionally. And you are following her in the beginning. You are in her point of view, and it is truly her whole world revolves around Doug and pleasing him and worrying about his moods and making sure he likes things a certain way. And I really loved this book, I think, from this kind of literary angle of like abusive relationships and what that looks like when that overtakes your life, when you kind of find yourself having to worry about your partner's reaction for every single thing. Um, and you get to the point where, she outsmarts certain things. And so she gains more sentience and more independence. And she kind of starts like putting things together. And it's funny because we talked about your worst of lists earlier. You did not like this one.
That's for sure. That was funny as you messaged me. So I will give props that I actually really enjoyed the beginning. I thought that the setup was really intriguing. I love the fact that it dealt with artificial intelligence and personhood and kind of exploring companion robots in a way that we often kind of imagine for the future. My mistake comes down, I think, to expectations. As I mentioned,
Yeah.
talked about before in the podcast, that I do also read a lot of science fiction. I picked up this one thing. It was going to be a deep dive into artificial intelligence, and I thought it was going to be really heavy in terms of those conversations and these sections in a way that I didn't expect as much, let's say, relationship drama.
Hmm.
There was certain twists and turns that took it to me to more soap opera and more just about the relationship itself. Again, I don't want to ever yuck your yum, and I know lots of other people who also loved it. A lot of people commented saying that they also enjoyed it, and like you mentioned, kind of seeing it as more of a literary novel rather
Yeah.
than seeing it from the science fiction perspective. I think completely changes it, and it was just so different than what I wanted that I was really disappointed by it, and it just probably wasn't a book for me,
Hmm.
especially thinking what I was getting myself into. But I'm glad you loved it, and I'm so sorry that I put on my worst list and crushed your spirits a little bit.
You did not. Like I said, I
Okay.
go into those every year, and you had several that I enjoyed on that list. So
Oh no.
no, it's totally
Why
fine.
do you put me back every year? I have no idea.
Because you have different opinions. You have different
Right.
books that I either didn't read or didn't deal with, and that then we cover more ground this way. Yes, I will say, yeah, this is a book that's focused a lot more on the relationship dynamics. If you want a book that's really grappling with like what is AI and what are the consequences to AI, and like let's write a book about that. This probably isn't the book. This
I
is
wanted that
definitely a
book.
book about, yeah, you want someone write this book for Rachel, okay?
Please help.
um, yes, this was definitely more about recognizing the dynamics in emotionally abusive relationships. And I know you mentioned this in your thing. There's a part where they go to therapy, which I thought was really funny because they have like a special therapist that specializes in like AI
Mhm.
human relationship problems. Um, but I just thought it was very interesting. I mean, kind of coming to the point that even when Doug is trying, you get to the point where you realize, like, even with you trying, it's not enough. Like, you can't give me what I need,
Doug is the
you know?
worst. I'll leave it there. I have no love for Doug.
Oh my gosh. And did you listen to this on audio as well through Libro FM?
I
Okay.
did, yeah.
He, I believe it's a female narrator, but when she yells, like he screams at Annie often,
Yeah.
like he berates her, and it was jarring for me. Like I was like, ugh,
Yeah.
like my heart was racing. It's like, oh god.
Yeah. That's why I was mad. I was like, why are they trying to make this work? He's the worst. You should just tell her to leave and get out of there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, that is Annie Bot by Sierra Greer. Do with that what you will.
Yeah, I'd love to have people weigh in which side, if they're pro Antibot or anti Antibot.
Is it time for the big one?
I think we finally are doing it right and saving it till later into the
I
podcast
know, I
episode.
know.
We
Doing it
stopped giving it
Academy.
away at the beginning.
We're doing it Academy Award style, saving it for the
Exactly.
end. Let's talk favorite novels.
Sounds good. I'll go first. You might want to strap in. We got quite a few books to talk about here. I tried to keep
Woo!
it short, but there's
Yeah.
too many good books. Again, this is a great year for horror, so recommend all of these and highly recommend. The first one I want to talk about is The Devil and Mrs. Davenport by Paulette Kennedy. And this is a story that is set in the 1950s. We follow a housewife and mother. At the beginning of the story, she believes that she has this dream or imagines that she has seen this incident with this young girl who has been found dead, and of course is trying to figure out what to do about it. So she ends up, of course, talking to her husband, talking to the police. And as you can imagine, they don't necessarily take her very seriously. This is one I highly recommend to anyone like myself that loves the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. While it is certainly not the same book, it dives into the same themes, so very much playing around with female hysteria, women not being believed, and just even the conversation of a woman's fulfillment, the idea of is it enough for a woman to be a wife and mother, or is it bad if they see more for themselves or don't necessarily perfectly conform to those roles? So I love this book in terms of the themes, the main character. It plays around with possible possession and the supernatural. And very much in my mind, a lot of the horror falls within the fact that this book is so subtle and quiet and is so much grounded again in the society expectations of the 1950s. I had a great time with it. I would love to see more people reading it. It didn't get a lot of buzz in the circles I was living in this year, so if people haven't read it yet, again, that is The Devil and Mrs. Davenport. And I thought it was really brilliant, and I think a lot of people will love it too, or at least should give it a try.
I loved this one too. I'm so glad you put it on your list and that we're
Okay, I
talking
was
about
thinking there's
it.
no way you haven't read this book this year. It's
Yes. Yeah.
okay, good. I assumed I was stealing it from you when I added it on here.
It was one of
Yes,
those,
I'm
I was like,
taking
oh,
it.
good. I was like, okay, it's gone now. It's fine. One of my top novels is definitely American Rapture by CJ Lead. Again, I loved this book. I felt like it was made for me, which is strange to say because I do not like zombie stories. So for me to place one as my favorite of the year, I'm sorry, is a big deal. But we are following a main character in this who is a sheltered Catholic girl. And she's sheltered like on top of being Catholic, like her parents are kind of extra fundamentalist and they don't allow her to access any type of media. You find out early on they kicked her brother out for essentially being gay. And this zombie virus breaks out that essentially turns people into like sex monsters is the only way I can think to say it. Um, and as someone who is sheltered, but also she has to like leave home. She's on this road trip. She kind of finds this like group of survivors that they're doing this kind of Midwest road trip, just trying to survive and get by and trying to find where they can be safe. This backdrop for a coming of age story, but also kind of coming into your own sexuality when you've been raised to have very confusing feelings about it, again with this backdrop of like sex monster zombie virus going around, um, and also dealing with coming to terms and working through religious trauma and deprogramming from messages of shame, and getting a new lease on life and learning to enjoy things and to be present, as what the world you knew itself is crumbling around you, kind of like these opposing things. I felt like she did it so well, and this book brought me to tears several times. So that is American Rapture by CJ Lead.
This is one I loved. It was just a great book. I would have had on my list if it wasn't on yours. And to be clear to anyone listening to this, that it sounds like the most ridiculous slapstick humor set up
Yeah.
with sex craved zombies, but trust me, it goes serious. The tone is just right. It's a kind of book
Mhm.
where reading the premise, I'll be honest, I didn't actually think it was going to work. It just sounded too over the top and silly, but it hits perfect. I really love this author. They wrote May Fly, which I believe was came out last year and was one of my favorites. And this is just such a great follow up to that. Like you
Mhm.
mentioned, the religious overtones, taking the very tropey subgenre of post apocalyptic, and certainly it leans into that, but having this main character who is so sheltered, having to go out into this ghostly world was just the perfect juxtaposition. I thought it was so well done. I really loved it too. So just giving an extra
Yeah.
bonus recommendation or thumbs up from me.
I love it. I love that you loved it too.
Yeah, I love when we love the same books instead of
Mhm.
Annie Bot. Let's not discuss that.
We shall no longer discuss it.
We'll put in a hole. So my next recommendation was a big surprise to me, and that is Model Home by River Solomon. A big surprise because the fact that this is a haunted house story, which is not usually my favorite subgenre. I know I must be the only person who regularly reads horror that isn't obsessed with the genre, particularly when it comes to haunted houses. But this one follows a group of siblings that growing up, they were moved into this neighborhood that was predominantly white. Specifically, they were the first black family to move in and really dealt with a lot of the feelings of being other, feeling like there was a lot of prejudice and just feeling like they didn't belong. And so they had a lot of trauma from that experience, very much were eager to move out, move away from home. However, when their parents passed away, they're now returning back, having to deal with the sale of the home and, of course, everything coming back. Now, this is, of course, a horror story, so there's more going on than simply meets the eye. And so, on top of the real life challenges they're dealing with, there perhaps is more to the home than meets the eye. Perhaps it wasn't quite a natural death that got their parents, or was it perhaps something more? So again, it is in a lot of ways a straightforward haunted house story, but I think this is the kind that really make me understand why this subgenre is so beloved because I think it is about the house, but it's also not. It's really about the characters and their mental state within the house. I think it's very relatable, that feeling of leaving your past behind when you move out and then having those feelings and emotional state come back when you're returning back. And again, blending in the supernatural or the potential of the supernatural so that you have, of course, the question of what is real, what is not, and of course, devolving into a haunted house climax that you would expect. So I love this one. I thought the writing was fantastic. The character work was so well done. I definitely want to read more by this author and highly recommend it, whether you love haunted house stories or not. This is, I think, in my mind, one of the best that came out this year.
I can't believe this one slipped by. I've seen it on a lot of best of lists, and I'm like, how did I miss this one?
It's one that I definitely think you should get to next year if you get a chance.
Yeah,
It seems exactly up your alley. I think you'll love it.
yeah. I do love a haunted house. My next pick is The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. This follows a young woman who is living in an apartment with her sister and her mother. At the beginning of the story, their father has recently left their mother and she is distraught. She kind of is in denial at the start of the story when we meet her, and she makes this special fish dinner, which she hopes will bring her husband back into their lives. And she eats one of the eyeballs for good luck, and offers it to her daughters. And the younger sister is immediately grossed out, but the older sister tries it and finds that she likes it. I said that very ominously, purposely. but so then in this story, the mother starts acting like really strange, like she's keeping secrets. She's like having phone calls, like she's talking on the phone in the bathroom. Um, and eventually, she tells the girls that she has started dating someone, and they're going to meet her boyfriend. They go to like a local Chinese restaurant where they meet up with him, and he is like the most awful Republican white man stereotype you could think of. Like, drives like a giant pickup, like ogles the waitresses at this Chinese restaurant, like right in front of everybody, is very rude. Um, and the the main character we follow becomes like obsessed with the idea of his eyeballs and just eating eyeballs. Like that's all she like thinks about now is like what would an eyeball taste like? And there are so many just descriptive passages about what she thinks eyeballs will taste like. And when I tell you that the thought of consuming eyeballs ends up consuming her entire life. But this is also like a story of like rage and revenge, and really looking at the fetishization that Asian women face. And even when there's like a character introduced that is set up to be this kind of like nice guy, there's still like elements of that in there as well. And it's just funny. You could just not predict where this book goes. I had such a time with it.
I read this one too. I liked it a lot. It just, yeah, made miss my. It just missed my list because it was on yours, but a great one for sure. Another one for myself is Lost Man's Lane by Scott Carson. This is a supernatural horror thriller that blends the genres together. We follow a young man or a young boy as he is growing up. Particularly, it starts out with him seeing this girl who is going into the back seat of a car with a man, and it turns out that he's the last one to see her. So naturally, he is very much in the forefront of the investigation, trying to figure out what happened to her. But this one, as I mentioned, is positioned more as that supernatural horror thriller. It's really not to be a mystery. It's really not meant to be a mystery, but instead focusing on what happens to this young man and really the larger story around it, kind of blending together all these genres. And so it has multiple layers. You have the nostalgia of youth, very much focused on the time period when this book is set. And then you also have, of course, that loss of innocence, my favorite part of a coming of age story. What does that say about me? Where you have the character go through an event that completely changes their life, forces them to grow up, and really lose that sense of delight and freedom and just changes everything forever. And so you follow that, and of course the story again does transpire. I hesitate to say more about what happens because it's one you want to figure out for yourself. I don't want to give away too much. But I love this one. I thought this one was brilliant. Very much a story in the vein of something you would read or expect to find from Stephen King if you're looking for a read alike in that regard. And just, again, great character work, very emotional, and a really good page turner at the center of the story. So, highly recommend Lost Man's Lane.
Oh, I'll have to check that out. Okay, my next pick is a double because we had an author that somehow released two five-star books for me in 1 year, which is just like a disgusting amount of talent. It
Jeez.
sickens me. I know.
Bad problem. What a bad problem to have.
Like I just can't believe it. So yes, this is I Was a Teenage Slasher and The Angel of Indian Lake by Stephen Graham Jones. I was like, how? How do you write two fantastic slasher books and release them in the same year? Like, how is that possible? I don't know. So, Angel of Indian Lake is the last of the is it Indian Lake trilogy? Yeah, is the last of the Indian Lake trilogy where we are following Jade Daniels' journey as a final girl. And as can be expected, it was super emotional and beautiful, and I cried. Which I know people that think about slashers don't assume is going to be the reaction you have when you finish a slasher series, but that is the case when it is Stephen Graham Jones. And then I loved I Was a Teenage Slasher. I It took such an inventive, interesting angle that I'm I'm kind of trying to figure out how to talk about it because realizing what was happening was such a fun reading experience. To describe it, this is about Tolly, who was a teenage slasher, and he's essentially recounting the details of the summer that he became a teenage slasher. And it sounds like it's just way more than it sounds like. I can't even tell you. You read it, right?
Yeah, I did. I fully admit you mentioned this year was there was a lot of teen slashers that came out. And the unfortunate thing that happened with me is that I'd read a lot of other slasher books before getting to this one. And
Mhm.
so I was a bit burnt out in the genre when I went to go pick it up. And so I went in going, "Oh, I'm not enjoying this as much as I should have." But despite being burned out on the subgenre, it was so well done. It didn't quite make my favorites only because I read so many slashers, but I should have read this one first last year, quite honestly. That it was by far the best of everything that I read this year when it comes to teen slashers or whatnot. And I think, yeah, it was doing so many things right. You're just like, oh, he's such a smart author. The way that he wove the narrative, I just thought
Yeah,
really, again, just set it above everything else. I think it's easy to write a just okay slasher, and it's so hard to do what he does. And I just don't know how he's so brilliant, I'll be honest.
I don't know. It's sickening. Just
Yeah.
kidding. Just we're obviously kidding.
Yeah, might be
It's
good to clarify that.
disgusting, disgusting amount of
Jesus.
talent. Just
Jeez.
really aggressive for no reason.
Just anger over there. My last favorite novel before we get into honorable mentions is The Night Guest. This is a translated book that was actually translated by one of my favorite sci fi authors, Mary Robinette
Mm,
Kowal. It's a very short little book that tells a story of a woman who has had a lot of terrible incidents that have happened leading up to the start of this book and is dealing with that. And now she's having trouble sleeping naturally. And eventually it starts to be revealed why she's having trouble sleeping. I don't think that that actually is the biggest twist or turn. You'll probably be able to guess if you're familiar with these type of stories. You'll see it coming, but it's not a story that I recommend because it surprised me in that regard. I recommend it because it's a quiet story with simple writing that turned into something that became very psychological for me. It's a story, again, I went into with no real expectations, went into it very blind, and soon enough, the way the narrative is told, it's told in almost a fragmented style. So you have certain pages with not a lot of writing on them, a few sentences. And I really got the experience from it of being very sleep deprived and fragmented and disjointed in a way that I
mhm.
really think the author was trying to project. So, especially for translated work, where I always worry that something gets lost in that translation, this book messed with my head in such a remarkable way. It's something I don't see very often when it comes to horror books, for them to hit me so personally. Again, it's a simple premise, but if you go in with the right expectations, if you just go in with an open mind, I really hope you can have that same experience because it's just such a special feeling when a book can just mess me up the way this one did. And that again is
Yeah,
The Night Guest.
I love that. Um, One of my final official picks is Surprising Nobody. It's So Thirsty by Rachel Harrison. Sorry, I love Rachel Harrison. I feel like every book she writes, she somehow is writing it to me about what I am going through at that specific moment in my life. Um, and I felt like this was no different. This is her take on the vampire story. And in this, we are following Sloane and Naomi. Sloane is having a birthday that she is not excited about, and her husband books her like a weekend getaway, not with him, with her friend Naomi, who is kind of like the wild card, chaotic friend that she's always had in her life, who kind of lives this like very fun, extravagant life. And and they go out, and Naomi meets some strangers at a bar and decides, yeah, it's actually a really good idea is for us in this town that we don't live in to meet up with these strangers for a party that does end up being an orgy and ends up being more than that. They end up getting turned into vampires.
Just that.
Just the usual. It's funny because I did relate to Sloane so much, where she was like, "I told you so. I told you this was a bad idea, and nobody wanted to listen to me." Like, but this book with the vampires, I felt like it was doing a lot of interesting things, talking about like aging anxiety and kind of anxiety in general, but also kind of deciding you deserve to have more out of life if you want more. Like, you don't need to settle. This is your one life. You get
Hmm.
to live and you get to dictate those terms. And
Yeah.
like, why are you selling yourself short? And I also love the way she talks about friendship and female friendship. And in this case, the idea of like you as the friend seeing a friend selling herself short and being like, you deserve more than that. Like, why can't you see you the way that I see you? Like in all your potential and all your glory. And like, I think you deserve all the best things. And I wish you thought you deserved that for yourself. It's kind of this fast paced road trip story. When it was comped, when it was first coming out, she talked about it being very like Thelma and Louise. And it just is this like ride or die friendship. Like, we're putting our hands up and we're hitting the gas and we're going. And like, who's by your side?
Nice.
So that's So Thirsty by Rachel Harrison.
Nice. So I'll just rattle through my honorable mentions here. The first one is Youth Juice by E.K. Salut. Have you read this one?
I really liked it, yes.
I loved it. This one is pitched as Devil Wears Prada meets American Psycho, follows this young woman who gets to work at this beauty industry job. And of course, there is this youth serum. Of course, there's maybe more going on. The story goes from there. Again, I've been loving all of this horror and thriller books that have been diving into Again, the beauty culture, I thought this one was great, delivered exactly like what I was expecting from it, which is fantastic. Other book I want to mention is Incidents Around the House by Josh Mallerman. This follows a young girl told from their perspective specifically in a house that appears to be targeted by the supernatural entity that the young girl calls Bad Mummy. And so it's a great book in the way that it is told from this perspective of innocence. So we as a reader recognize that there's a lot more going in to the house in terms of what is happening from the adult point of view. And so we catch on to things that they don't. I'm often really hit or miss when it comes to a young child protagonist, and I was delightfully surprised how well this one worked. I did physically read it. I do wonder if it'd be challenging to do an audio just because you have a really naive young protagonist, but it just hit right. I found it intriguing, a little bit unsettling, suspenseful, and I had a really good time with it. So I did want to mention that one as well. Again, Incidents Around the House by Josh Mallerman.
Yeah, that one really surprised me. And I am going to be honest, I wasn't going to read it because I saw child narrator. And I was
I
like,
was
no,
thinking
that
of
is
you.
like, that is
Yeah.
my most hated device. But, and then everyone was talking about it. The buzz was unstoppable. So I was like, okay, I will read it. And yeah, I was pleasantly surprised. I feel like there are just natural pitfalls to using that device, and I felt like he
Mhm.
worked around those as best as you can. And
Agreed.
it was creepy. There's a scene about going to the bathroom in the middle of the night that I think about now every time I wake up in the dark to go to the bathroom. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that one surprised me because I'm very similar to you when it comes to child narrators. But that one just, I know he hit right. I think he was aware that it's not a popular trope or can
mhm,
be very divisive and worked around that accordingly.
yeah. Okay. My honorable mentions, starting with Diavola by Jennifer Marie Thorne. I had such a good time with this. Um, I I also just love like bad dysfunctional families, like terrible families. So this is about a big family that is vacationing in Italy, and they end up staying in a haunted villa. Um, and the main character you are following is essentially the scapegoat for this toxic, awful family. Like everything that goes wrong, they find a way to blame on her. And when she's the person that's kind of piecing this supernatural thing together, of course, they do not believe her. They find a way to blame everything on her. And just the journey that this character goes on, you are rooting for her, but it also finds time to be kind of darkly funny at points. Um, I just thought like a very inventive and interesting addition to kind of like a haunted vacation dysfunctional family horror.
Who
Did you read
doesn't
this
love a
one?
messed up family? It's one that's on my read next year list. I
I
somehow
think
didn't
you'll
get
like
to it.
it.
I think
I
so
think
too.
you'll like it. And then I wanted to add as my second honorable mention is The Haunting of Velkwood by Gwendolyn Keist. This is about a suburb, like a street that was kind of stuck in time. Like there was a weird, I don't know how to explain it, like a force field that happened around this street where like people could not go in or out, and like the people that stayed on the street just kind of are stuck in time. But you are following um a main character who was able to get out, and you see how kind of being a survivor of not only this but of the trauma she faced growing up has shaped who she is. And she gets contacted by someone who like wants to do a study, of course. um, and she finds that she actually is able to go back in and document what she is seeing. And she also meets up with another neighborhood friend who was also able to get out, and just the journey they go on, kind of like literally confronting their past that is stuck in time and coming to terms with the truth about themselves and what that means. I loved this because I really loved her novel, The Rust Maidens, which I feel like treads similar ground, but I feel like she really perfected it in this, and I quite enjoyed that. the world building, the concept was very inventive. I liked it. It was The Haunting of Velkwood by Gwendolyn Keist.
Another one I need to read. I don't know if I've read anything by her, and I definitely need to correct that next year. This is always the podcast episode where I'm reminded of all of my glaring gaps in my reading life.
I know this is the one where I add to my TBR too. All right, well, should we talk about some backlist books, some books that did not come out this year that we liked?
Sure. The book I want to recommend for this one is Bloom by Delilah S. Dawson. I feel like it's one you might have read last year, or at least is absolutely up your alley.
Oh,
This
okay.
is what I describe as cozy horror, so something I think, or I'm guessing we might see more of next year. And so this actually only came out last year, so not that far of a backlist, but one I missed. And we follow this woman who is going to this artisanal market, this farmer's market, where she sees this other woman and just becomes obsessed with her. So it's a story that is somewhat of this sapphic romance, but is also a horror story. So it very much leans into the side of what happens with obsessive love and the terrible things that ensue. But yet, despite the fact that it does go to dark places, it was surprisingly cozy because, again, I think it plays a lot with the themes of what we see as like cottage core culture
Yeah.
and coziness, and again, going to the farmers market with candles and all of these elements. And then it's just a really nice, again, juxtaposition of these darker themes. I loved it. It was short, sweet, and easily one of my favorite books that I missed from last year. So highly recommend Bloom by Delilah S. Dawson.
I need to read it. I did read her novella Guillotine that came out this year, and I also had
Oh,
a really fun time with that.
yes. It was a good year for reading her.
Hmm. My backlist pick is All's Well by Mona Awad. I read this at the beginning of the year, um, but I love it, and I think I might officially be a Mona Awad stan. I think this is what cements it because I loved Rouge. Made my year end favorite last year, but this is about a drama teacher at a liberal arts college, and she used to be kind of once an up and coming actress until she fell off the stage during a production of All's Well That Ends Well and hurt herself and has been living in chronic pain since then. A lot of this book deals with living with chronic pain and going to the doctor and not being believed, and you get so frustrated for this main character and all that she's had to endure, and that, like, she'll try a new therapy and there's always this excitement of like, will this be the one that takes me seriously? And eventually they're like, pain is in the mind actually. But what is happening in this book is that she wants to do a production of All's Well That Ends Well, for her theater group at this college. But there is a kind of organized mutiny around among the students, led by one like nepo baby girl whose like parents are big donors, um, where they want to do a different play, and like this is kind of her last straw. She's like, of course this happens to me.
Yep.
um, and you don't have to be like super well versed. Like, I'm not super well versed in Shakespeare to get all the Shakespearean references and alliterations, but she goes to a bar where she meets three mysterious figures, um, who promise her success and that her play is going to be put on. And after this conversation with them, she notices that her life kind of just starts getting better. She's not in pain anymore. Like, she was able to take control back of her group. And, but it is also a decline for her sanity as you are following her telling this story. And she becomes like more brazen, just more unhinged as the story goes on. And it was just like my favorite thing ever. I loved it so much. That is All's Well by Mona Awad.
That sounds great. I know her other book, Bunny, but I hadn't even heard of this one. It completely flew under my radar. A lot of people have been telling me to read more by them. I would know they're Canadian, so I
Oh
don't know what
yeah.
I'm doing with my life over here.
Did you read Rouge? Because that's like
No,
her beauty book,
I
her
really
like
should. I
beauty
think you
horror.
talked about it last year, and I
Yeah.
said I was
Hmm.
going to read it this year, and then I lied to myself. Again, my shame list. Next year for sure. All right, everyone check up back on
She's
me.
her style is very weird. Like you need to know that she's,
Yeah, I'm here for that. I'm good with
yeah,
that.
she gets surreal. All right. Well, we are at our tradition point. We're talking chilling obsessions. What have you been
Great.
enjoying lately, Rachel?
Well, as for my usual tradition, I'm several years behind in terms of the popular movies. So I just watched Midsummer for the first time this Halloween. And so even though everyone and their dog has already read it, even though everyone and their dog has already watched it, I figured I'd still share my experience. You all know, of course, the story of this young woman who has this traumatic event with her family, ends up trying to get closer to her boyfriend who is distancing himself. They go off to this commune celebration in Sweden, and the story goes from there. This is one I went into completely blind. First off, the actual incident that starts off her trauma, I actually found to be the most terrifying or horrific part of the whole movie. That part stuck
Yeah.
with me. I had nightmares about that whole scene afterwards. I was not prepared for that at all. And then you have the rest of the horror movie, which my friend pointed out who was watching it with me, is that you don't often see horror movies where it all takes place in the bright sunshine. And it almost makes it more terrifying because I think we often think we're safe as long as it's bright outside, as long as it's not nighttime, we're okay. And I think really bringing the horror into the daylight where everything is bright and smiling and shining just was a really different way to play a horror movie, and I think it made it more
Yeah.
challenging. Like it just didn't really go for the easy way of, oh, let's make it nighttime and all
Hmm.
of that. I will add, not that it's important, but the boyfriend Christian was the absolute worst. I hated him so much throughout the movie, and a lot of the friends were just absolutely terrible. I did like Mark though. I thought he was really funny. And
Which
so
one
I'm
was Mark?
oh, he was, I don't know, kind of the he was the one who was weird about anything touching him and was walking funny through the grass. I think
Is
I
he like?
latched on to the wrong parts of the movie. Clearly, I'm focused on the big plot events,
Yeah.
uh, but regardless, I really enjoyed it. I'm so glad I'm finally checking it off my bucket list of all the modern horror movies that I haven't seen yet. I really love the
Nice.
studio. Of course, everything that they do, I'm happy with and just tend to
Yeah.
love. A24
Yeah.
is just really brilliant. So a little bit late, but yes,
Hey.
love that one
There's
and
no.
highly recommend it if there's anyone watching it who somehow
Mhm.
hasn't, or anyone listening to this who somehow hasn't seen the movie yet.
There is no expiration date on movies. You can enjoy them whenever.
Let's go with
Um,
that.
I I have a lot of things I've been enjoying lately. Speaking of A24, I saw the TV Glow and absolutely loved it. Made me cry. I said that like 7 times, so big crier.
I'm learning
um,
this about you.
yeah. Um, but it was funny because I watched it, I really liked it, and I went and rewatched We're All Going to the World's Fair, which was that director's previous film, and I believe their feature film, their debut film, but I'm not sure. Um, and I had a newfound understanding and love of We're All Going to the World's Fair because I feel like when I watched We're All Going to the World's Fair, I put it on while I was putting away laundry. And I was like,
Hmm.
nothing is happening in this movie. Like, what is happening? Nothing is happening. And after watching, I saw the TV Glow, cue the Danny DeVito and It's Always Sunny meme of the like, I get it. I get it. I finally get it.
Yes.
um, so I really liked that. But I've also been loving a newsletter
Ooh.
that I find that I am looking forward to I believe it comes out every Friday, but it's called I Know What You Did Last Thursday or Friday. I feel like I've seen it both ways on their site. But it's written by E.K. Sathu of Youth Juice and Gabrielle Moss, who wrote Paperback Crush, which was one of my favorites, when I read it that I mentioned, which
Hmm.
was the look back at the kind of retro young adult books of the like 80s and 90s. That was so fun. So they release this newsletter every week, and it's about different topics. Like they did a topic on um, different like true crime stuff. Like they did one on like John Benet Ramsey, and then at the end, like they'll recommend kind of books and movies that touch on like similar themes and topics. Like the one this week was about space. Um, and I believe it was Gabrielle writing, but I related where it's like space is stressful because it's like overwhelming, but it's also like boring. It's like somehow both at the same time, like nothing is happening there, but also like the thought of the expansive state of space fills me with dread. I'm like, yes.
That sounds so fun.
It's just really funny, and
Hmm.
I find that I look forward to it every week for it to
Yeah,
hit my inbox.
that's always a
Uh,
good sign.
you know, but what is your final girl song, Rachel?
I feel lucky that I keep getting to add to the playlist each year. So I believe 2 years ago I had a song by Metric, so I thought I'd return back to that. I just love them. I think they're a great Canadian indie group. And so this year I want to have All Comes Crashing, which is technically a love song, but arguably every song I feel like is either a breakup song or a love song. But I thought some of the lyrics really hit home in terms of a final girl about really starting again and coming out of the ashes of the events. So some of the lyrics are, I won't sing them, don't worry. Starting over after it breaks, when push comes to shove, we do not fall out of love, we double down, we do not fade. And I just really love the tone of it. I love the music, which again, you can look up for yourself rather than me torturing you all here, but highly recommend. I love this band, and that is just my final girl song of the year.
I love that sticking to your Canadian roots,
It's
keeping
required, I
it
assume.
keeping it Canadian, so they don't take your citizenship away.
Exactly. Well, that's actually a thing here in Canada. We have to have a certain percentage of music on a radio has to be Canadian as per
I
Canadian law. So we
I
get a lot of
did hear
Bieber
this.
and Nickelback, but we also think we'll get things like Metric.
Nice. My final girl song this year is "Loud Bark" by Mannequin Pussy. It's funny. I discovered them this year, and Brian McCauley picked, I think it's "I Got Heaven" for his final girl song earlier this year, and it's a great album. But this song I just felt was perfect. The opening lyrics to this song are, "Not a single motherfucker who has tried to lock me up could get the collar around my neck or find one that's big enough. I'm a waste of a woman, but I taste like success. I keep all of my sugar where you know you like it best." And then the chorus is, "I am a loud bark, deep bite." It's just like screaming it like louder and louder. "I'm a loud bark, deep bite."
I love how you have I love your music taste. I just think that you always come across so like sweet and quiet and gentle and then you listen to these like rage ballads. Like I had no idea there was this side of you. It sounds like it. I'm gonna look it up.
It is. But it is. It's just like I'm too much, and you were just gonna have to deal with that. And I feel like that's final girl energy. Like I'm unapologetic. I am here, and you're gonna have to fucking deal with it. Okay.
I
I'm
love
a
it.
loud bark and a deep bite. Okay.
Love it so much. I love this side of you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on here and chatting. Best of favorites.
Oh, thanks. I never get tired of this episode. It's so much fun to get to gush about our favorites, come back here and just look back on the year with you. It's again always such a treat. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you to everyone listening and putting up with my very unpopular opinions, as I tend to always find something different to recommend. But again, hopefully it helps to round out the episode with some uh, different things that might not have made your list, Stephanie.
No, we love it. And we love an unpopular opinion. It would be boring if all of us had the same opinions and we all just agreed on the same five books.
That'd be great. But you can all agree with my books. I'm good with that.
Yeah.
I think it's so funny over
um,
here.
but people can also find you on YouTube, right? If this is their first time tuning in.
For sure. So for those who don't know me, you can look me up on YouTube at The Shades of Orange. I'm also on Instagram and Blue Sky with the same handle, The Shades of Orange. Definitely feel free to reach out to me there. I'm posting twice a week on YouTube, Tuesday and Thursday, talking horror, thrillers, and other dark things.
Ooh, all right. Well, thank you. And here's to a good 2025 reading year.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Books in the Freezer is a bi-weekly podcast. We post episodes every other Tuesday. You can find us on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and TikTok at Books in the Freezer, or send us an email at booksinthefreezer@gmail.com. Show notes for this episode and all previous episodes can be found at booksinthefreezer.com, where you will find a list of the books mentioned. Thank you so much for listening. I have been your host, Stephanie. I hope you had a fantastic 2024, and I hope you join us next year for the 2025 Books in the Freezer Reading Challenge. You can find the prompts on Instagram, and you can officially join and participate by adding books on Storygraph by looking for 2025 Books in the Freezer Reading Challenge. So hope to see you there. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time on Books in the Freezer.